Good morning, Wyoming and beyond. This is product attorney Jason Oakes with your Wyoming Health Watch. Good morning. It's October 20th, 2019, and I'm really excited because I'm having the really fortuitous opportunity to spend some time with Chris Tisi, a good friend and a great lawyer who's been in the forefront of many nationwide product liability litigations for the better part of 30 years. Chris, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here, although you're aging me a little bit.
Well, Chris, as I told you before we started recording this morning, I wanted to bring some valuable information to people of Wyoming and beyond regarding the talcum powder ovarian cancer mesothelioma litigation that's been ongoing for some time. I know you've been at the forefront of the litigation, and I was hoping that you could share with us and my listeners a little bit about how you became involved in that litigation, what your role has been, and kind of what the status of it is right now.
Well, let me work backwards on your questions, Jason. Currently, there are probably an estimated, over 10,000 cases currently pending of ovarian cancer in state and federal court. There are also cases involving people who claim that they developed mesothelioma, which is a lung cancer that is associated with asbestos from exposure to talcum powder. I got involved in the case, and I really have to tell you, Jason, I was very hesitant initially because, what could be more trusted than baby powder?
Mm-hmm.
Most of us who have children leave the hospital with three things. They leave the hospital with a blanket, a beanie, and baby powder. And so I was really reluctant to believe that there was evidence that this could be a hazardous product. But then we did some research and looked into it, consulted with experts, and I firmly believe that there is a very serious risk of about 25 to 60% increased risk for women who use this product over a period of time of ovarian cancer, which is, as you know, is a very, very serious cancer.
Chris, so that 25 to 60%, is that rooted in the scientific literature?
Yeah, I mean, so, without getting too technical about it, there have been approximately 30 or so what we call epidemiology studies, human studies, looking at the risk in different populations, different countries, involving different researchers, and they have been remarkably consistent. And these studies have shown that there is an increased risk, and in many cases, in most cases, a statistically significant increased risk in the range that I'm talking about now, of 25 to 60%.
What is the amount of exposure that one would require to hit the 25 to 60%? Has that been quantified to date?
It has not been quantified with any specificity, Jason. I will tell you, it's like smoking cigarettes, right? You can, the longer you use it, the more frequently you use it, the more you are at potential risk. And so that's what the evidence shows.
Out of the total number of cases that are currently filed, Chris, can you give us just an estimate of the percentage that are ovarian cancer cases versus mesothelioma cases?
Well, I have been very closely working with the ovarian cancer cases that are pending in federal court, and there are, I believe, approximately 12,000 cases the last time that I looked. There have been cases that have been tried mostly in state courts in the United States that involve people who develop mesothelioma, which is, if there's asbestos in the talc, it can cause this kind of cancer through inhalation. And there has cases, although fortunately I think it is rarer than the ovarian cancer cases.
And talking for a moment on the mesothelioma end of things, what has been Johnson & Johnson's position thus far with respect to whether there even is asbestos in their talcum powder product?
Well, I'd like to back up for a second, just for a second. One of the things that these studies that I talked about, these 4 decades of studies, demonstrated is that there is an increased risk. And one of the next things we did in speaking to the experts is looking at what constitutes baby powder, because I think we don't really think about it when we put it on ourselves or use it. And when we started looking deeper into it, talcum powder is mined. You go into a mine, you grind it up, you process it, and one of the things that we learned as we looked into it is that there was, small amounts of asbestos and other potential carcinogens that were identified in the 1970s. As a result, there was some testing that was started in order to minimize that, but the tests are not specific enough to get all of the asbestos and identify all the asbestos. Last Friday, as we were talking before we got on, last Friday, the FDA announced that it had done random testing of Johnson's baby powder, and they found trace amounts of asbestos. And as a result, on Friday of this past week, Johnson & Johnson announced a recall of approximately 30,000 units of baby powder. I must say that I think that the problem has been much more pervasive over a longer period of time than just one lot. That's what we think the evidence shows. But the fact that that we believe that there is asbestos in the product and has been periodically over the years contributes to my conclusion and our position that the use of these products is capable of causing ovarian cancer in some women and mesothelioma in some people.
I saw the recall last Friday, Chris, on the discovery of asbestos in that lot, and that specific lot number that you're right had about 30,000 plus bottles in it. In fact, I was just at Albertsons this morning, the same Albertsons you and I both visit. I know you live in Wilson, Wyoming. Cross-checking to make sure none of those bottles were on the shelves, and I'm happy to say that I didn't come across any. It makes me curious if you've been able to conclude through the information you've gathered in litigation or speaking with and working with the experts, whether or not Johnson & Johnson knew about this potential danger before the litigation started, and if so, how far back does it go?
Well, our investigation suggests that they've known about it since the late 60s, early 1970s, but the information really became crystallized with the first human epidemiology study, which was published in 1982, so about 40 years ago, by researchers at Harvard University. Jason, I will tell you, sadly, I think that there has been evidence of this for over 40 years.
For individuals who are listening, Chris, and wondering, is there any sort of alternative, especially a safer alternative? Is there anything out there for them?
This is kind of the crazy thing, Jason. For many years, many manufacturers have converted their cosmetic powder products to cornstarch, which is basically derived from corn, and there's no risk involved in corn. And many manufacturers who have used talcum powder in the past, for example, on surgical gloves or condoms, have switched over to using cornstarch. So, there is a safer alternative, but even larger than that. I mean, you really have to remember, Jason, that Cosmetic powders is not a necessary product. This is not a product that is used to cure disease or even treat a medical condition. These are just cosmetics, and there really should be no risk with these products at all. So whether or not there are safer alternatives, there are, but they really should not be talcum powder that is used, certainly not used for women in their genital area.
Chris, I think a question that many listeners would wonder is, has our U.S. FDA taken any action regarding talcum powder? If not, why not? And thirdly, are there any equivalents to the U.S. FDA elsewhere in the world that have taken action?
Well, let me just make 3 points. The first point, in answer to your question, is yes, there are other regulatory agencies that have looked at this issue. The most recent of which is Health Canada, which is the Canadian version of the U.S. FDA, and they published a proposal last year that concluded that there was evidence that talcum powder products cause ovarian cancer. They looked at all the data that we looked at and our experts looked at and reached a very similar conclusion that we reached. As a result of that, the U.S. Congress recently held hearings in February of last year, public hearings on that issue. So you may ask yourself, where has the FDA been? The FDA does not, and has made it clear that it relies on the companies to police cosmetic products. The FDA has some oversight on making sure that there are no false claims made, etc., but relies on the company to change a label or change a formulation in response to a potential safety risk. I must tell you, I think that recently the FDA, as a result of the recall this past Friday, it is my real hope that the FDA becomes much more vigilant in requesting that something be done, because it's as I indicated, ovarian cancer is an extremely serious cancer. By the time it is diagnosed, your chances of recovery, sadly, are not as good as other cancers. It's a very serious cancer, Jason.
Chris, has there been to date any plaintiff jury trials, and further, any juries that have sided with the plaintiffs on the ovarian cancer litigation?
Yeah, there have been multiple state court trials. The federal court cases have been consolidated before a judge a federal judge sitting in New Jersey, and recently we had hearings to ask the judge to allow these cases in federal court to proceed to a jury trial. There have been cases that have been tried in state courts around the country, and the vast majority of those cases, when the jury has heard the evidence, have concluded that Johnson & Johnson knew of the potential risk, failed to take action that they should have taken, and as a result awarded damages to the plaintiff.
Chris, let me ask you my final question, and obviously we talked earlier, and I appreciate your support for Wyoming Health Watch, bringing valuable information to people of Wyoming and elsewhere that is not about you and me and not about our law firms. But what sort of information, having been on the front lines of the litigation, would you provide to a listener who thinks she may have contracted ovarian cancer or mesothelioma, or knows a good mother or sister that did so after exposure of talcum powder? And I realize you're not a medical doctor, but what would you share with a client who was coming into your office and asked you that question?
Well, more broadly than that, if I can reframe your question a little bit,
sure.
Jason, I I would tell people that they should not use talcum powder products. Where cornstarch is available, they should use that. And if they are going to use talcum powder, and check the label. If you're going to use talcum powder, do not use it in the genital area. You really don't want to put yourself in a position where you've increased the risk of a potential problem. If you believe that you have cancer, or you've been told you have cancer, speak to your doctor about and follow your doctor's instructions. I just think the biggest and most important thing is that the word get out that there is this potential risk for a product that really is that we may assume is completely safe, and that there is this potential risk out there.
Chris, I really appreciate your willingness to set aside time this Sunday to help me provide valuable information to the people of Wyoming on this very important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. It is a really serious issue in my view. So I appreciate your efforts to bring it to the attention of the public.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you to my listeners. I will post this podcast on WyomingHealthWatch.com. Again, this is Jason Oakes. Appreciate your time this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.